The judge's gavel came down like a death sentence, and Captain Sarah Chen watched 20 years of her life get handed to a man who had never worked a day in his life. But what the court didn't know was that the combat veteran sitting silently in the defendant's chair had just spotted something that would turn this entire charade upside down. The federal marshal standing by the door wore a small pin on his lapel, one that only a handful of people in the world would recognize, and it told her everything she needed to know about how this nightmare was about to end. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen had faced down insurgents in the mountains of Afghanistan, survived 3 tours in Iraq, and earned decorations that most soldiers only dream of. But nothing in her military career had prepared her for the battlefield of family court in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. She sat rigidly in the wooden chair, her spine straight despite the crushing weight of what was unfolding around her. The courtroom smelled of old wood polish and broken dreams, and every word spoken seemed designed to strip away another piece of her dignity. Her soon-to-be ex-husband Marcus sat across the aisle with his attorney, a shark in a $1,000 suit who had turned character assassination into an art form. Marcus looked nothing like the man she had married 12 years ago. Gone was the struggling graduate student she had supported through law school while she bled for her country overseas. In his place sat a bloated, entitled stranger who wore success like armor and wielded her sacrifices as weapons against her. The opposing counsel, a silver-haired predator named Harrison Webb, was in the middle of painting her as an unstable veteran who was unfit for custody of her 8-year-old daughter Emma. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had destroyed families for a living and slept soundly at night. Your Honor, Webb continued, his tone dripping with false concern. My client has documented evidence of Captain Chen's erratic behavior since her return from her final deployment. Night terrors, violent outbursts, and inability to maintain stable employment in the civilian sector. We have witnesses who will testify to her volatile temperament and her inappropriate discussions of combat experiences in front of the minor child. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Every word was a calculated lie, but lies delivered with enough conviction in a courtroom could become legal truth. She had learned that painful lesson over the past 6 months of legal proceedings that had drained her savings and her faith in the justice system. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, looked down from her bench with the expression of someone who had heard it all before. Sarah could see the preliminary judgment forming in the judge's eyes. Another damaged veteran, another casualty of war who couldn't adapt to civilian life. The narrative was so familiar, so easy to believe. What none of them knew was that Sarah's military service record was still classified at the highest levels. Her official personnel file showed a standard Army captain with 3 overseas deployments. It didn't mention the Delta Force selection she had completed, the black operations she had led, or the fact that she was one of only 12 women ever to earn a place in the most elite special operations unit in the military. Her real service record was buried so deep that even her own husband had never known the true nature of her work. The irony was suffocating. She had spent years protecting American freedoms in the shadows, and now she was watching those same freedoms get twisted into chains in an American courtroom. Marcus knew exactly which buttons to push because she had been foolish enough to share her struggles with him during their marriage. The sleepless nights after losing teammates, the weight of command decisions that had saved some lives while ending others, the challenge of transitioning from a world where her word was law to a civilian world where her gender made her authority questionable. He had weaponized her vulnerability and turned it into a legal strategy. Every moment of weakness she had shared with him in the dark hours of their marriage had been cataloged and saved for this moment. It was a betrayal so complete, so calculated, that it took her breath away. Sarah's mind drifted back to the night everything had started to unravel. She had returned from her final deployment 8 months ago, carrying the weight of a mission that would never make it into any official reports. Her team had successfully extracted a group of kidnapped American contractors from a terrorist stronghold in Syria, but they had lost 2 good soldiers in the process. She came home to what she thought was a loving husband and a daughter who needed her. Instead, she found moving boxes in the hallway and divorce papers on the kitchen table. Marcus had served her on her 2nd day back on American soil while she was still processing the deaths of her teammates and the classified debriefing sessions that would haunt her for years to come. The timing wasn't coincidental. Marcus had consulted with Webb months before her return, planning the divorce proceedings while she was still dodging bullets in a war zone. They had calculated that catching her off guard while she was emotionally vulnerable and dealing with the transition back to civilian life would give them the maximum advantage in court. They had been right. The past 8 months had been a legal blitz that left her reeling. Every asset she had accumulated during her military career, every benefit she had earned through her service was being divided up like spoils of war. The house she had purchased with her hazard pay, the college fund she had built for Emma during her deployments, even the small investment account she had maintained through automatic deductions while she was overseas. All of it was being handed over to a man who had never risked anything more dangerous than a paper cut from a law book. But it was the custody arrangement that cut deepest. Webb was arguing that Emma needed stability, a normal home environment, away from the influence of a mother whose job was to do violence on behalf of the American people. He painted a picture of Sarah as a walking time bomb, a damaged warrior who might snap at any moment and traumatize an innocent child. The federal marshal standing by the courtroom door had been watching the proceedings with the calm, alert expression of a professional. His name tag read Deputy Marshal Rodriguez, and he wore his uniform with the bearing of someone who understood duty and honor. Sarah noticed him early in the proceedings because of the way he carried himself, the subtle signs that marked him as someone prior military. But it was the small brass pin on his collar that made her heart skip a beat. It was a miniature version of the unit insignia, the classified symbol that identified members of the most elite Special Operations Unit. The pin was so small, so innocuous, that most people would assume it was just another piece of military decoration. But Sarah knew better. She knew that pin was earned through blood, sweat, and a level of sacrifice that most people couldn't comprehend. Marshal Rodriguez caught her looking at him, and their eyes met for a brief moment. In that instant, she saw recognition flicker across his features. Not recognition of her face, but recognition of something deeper. He had seen the way she carried herself, the controlled stillness that marked someone who had operated at the highest levels of military special operations. The courtroom proceedings continued around them, but Sarah felt something shift in the air. She wasn't alone anymore. There was someone in this room who understood the true cost of her service, someone who knew that the woman being described by the opposing counsel bore no resemblance to the warrior sitting in the defendant's chair. Judge Morrison was reviewing the financial documents when Webb dropped his final bomb. He stood up with theatrical precision and addressed the court with the confidence of a man delivering a killing blow. Your Honor, we would also like to enter into evidence these medical records that show that Captain Chen has been receiving treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and has been prescribed medication for anxiety and depression. We believe this clearly demonstrates that she is not physically fit to have primary custody of a minor child. The medical records hit the judge's desk like an accusation. Sarah felt the walls of the courtroom closing in on her. Those records were from the mandatory counseling sessions she had attended after her final deployment, standard procedure for anyone returning from classified operations. The medication had been prescribed as a precaution, a way to help her sleep during the initial transition period. She had stopped taking it after 6 weeks and had been cleared for full duty by the Army's psychological evaluation team. But in the context of this courtroom, torn from their proper context and presented as evidence of instability, those records looked damning. Sarah watched Judge Morrison's expression harden as she reviewed the documents. The narrative was complete now. Damaged veteran, unstable, medicated, unfit for motherhood. That was the moment Sarah Chen, decorated Special Operations veteran, made a decision that would change everything. She had spent her entire military career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She had bled for the principle that justice and truth would always triumph over lies and manipulation. She wasn't going to let that principle die in a Phoenix courtroom while her daughter's future hung in the balance.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The battle lines had been drawn, and Captain Sarah Chen was ready for war. The recess that Judge Morrison called felt like a tactical pause in the middle of a firefight. Sarah remained seated as the courtroom began to empty, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing controlled and measured. Marcus and his legal team huddled near the plaintiff's table, their voices low and satisfied. They thought they had delivered the decisive blow. Sarah's own attorney, a well-meaning but overwhelmed public defender named Janet Mills, approached with the defeated expression of someone who had just watched a client get steamrolled by superior firepower. Janet was competent enough, but she was fighting this battle with a pocket knife while the opposition wielded tactical nuclear weapons. "Sarah, we need to talk," Janet whispered, her voice tight with stress. "Those medical records are devastating. Webb blindsided us. I don't know how they got access to classified military medical files, but the damage is significant. We need to consider a plea arrangement." Sarah's eyes never left Marshal Rodriguez, who was standing near the back of the courtroom, ostensibly reviewing some paperwork but clearly listening to every conversation happening around him. She could see him processing the dynamics, the power imbalances, the casual corruption that was playing out in front of him. "Give me 5 minutes," Sarah told Janet. "I need some air." She stood and walked toward the courtroom exit, her movements deliberate and controlled. As she passed Marshal Rodriguez, she paused just long enough to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "The Vineyard, 2018, Operation Ghost Protocol," she said, never breaking stride. Rodriguez's head snapped up, his eyes wide with recognition. Those words were a code, a reference to a classified joint operation between Army Special Forces and Deputy Marshal tactical teams that had taken place in the hills outside Napa Valley. It had been a counterterrorism operation that officially never happened, involving the interdiction of a domestic terrorist cell planning attacks on federal installations. Sarah had been the ground team leader. Rodriguez, she now realized, had been part of the Federal Tactical Response Unit that had provided backup during the final assault. They had never met face-to-face during the operation, both units operating under strict compartmentalization protocols, but they had saved each other's lives that night without ever knowing each other's names. 10 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the small coffee shop across the street from the courthouse, sitting in a back corner booth. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, still in uniform, his eyes scanning the room with professional thoroughness before settling on her table. He slid into the seat across from her, his expression serious. "Captain Chen, I presume. Or do you prefer Major? Your actual rank was never clear in the after-action reports." "Captain will do, though technically I'm civilian now. How long have you been with the Marshal Service?" 8 years. Transferred over after my Army discharge." Rodriguez leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That operation in the Vineyard? Your team saved my partner's life. The intelligence you provided about the secondary explosive device prevented a catastrophe." Sarah nodded, remembering the night. The terrorist cell had rigged the entire compound with sophisticated booby traps designed to kill law enforcement officers responding to the scene. Her team's reconnaissance had identified the threats and passed them along to the federal response units. "What I'm seeing in that courtroom is a fellow operator getting railroaded by people who've never risked anything more dangerous than a bad stock pick. That attorney of your husband's, Webb, he's got connections that run deep into some very questionable places." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't fighting alone. What kind of connections? Rodriguez pulled out his phone and opened a secure messaging app. "Webb's law firm has been under federal investigation for the past 18 months, money laundering primarily. They've been helping wealthy clients hide assets offshore, and some of those clients have ties to organizations we've been tracking. The investigation is ongoing, which is why I can't take official action, but I can share some things that might be helpful to your case." He showed her a series of photographs on his phone. Financial documents, bank records, correspondence between Webb's firm and various shell companies. The pattern was clear. Webb specialized in making inconvenient assets disappear, and his client list read like a who's who of white-collar criminals and corrupt politicians. "Your husband hired the right lawyer if his goal was to make your military benefits vanish into thin air, but he made a critical error. He assumed you'd roll over and accept defeat, just like every other client Webb has steamrolled. He doesn't know what he's really dealing with." Sarah studied the documents, her mind processing the implications. "How does this help me in family court?" Webb's methods involve hiding assets, falsifying financial records, and bribing court officials when necessary. If we can prove that your husband's financial disclosures are fraudulent, if we can show that Webb has been manipulating the system, then everything they've built against you crumbles." Rodriguez pulled up another file on his phone. "Your husband has been moving money for the past year, Sarah. Large sums, transferred to accounts that don't officially exist. The house you thought he was fighting for? He put it in his brother's name 6 months ago. The business he claims is struggling? It's been generating profits that he's funneling through a series of shell companies Webb helped him establish." The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Marcus hadn't just planned a divorce. He had orchestrated a comprehensive financial fraud designed to leave her with nothing while preserving his wealth through illegal means. Every tear she had shed over their failing marriage, every moment of self-doubt about her ability to be a good mother and wife, had been calculated manipulations designed to keep her compliant while he robbed her blind. "There's more," Rodriguez said, his expression grim. "Webb has done this before. I've identified at least 6 other cases where military veterans, particularly women, have been targeted using similar tactics. False psychological evaluations, manipulated custody assessments, fraudulent financial disclosures. It's a systematic pattern of exploitation. Sarah's hands clenched into fists on the table. He's been hunting us, specifically targeting military families, female veterans in particular. The strategy relies on societal prejudices about women in combat roles and the stigma surrounding PTSD.
Webb has turned bias into a business model, and he's made millions doing it. The coffee shop seemed to fade around them as Sarah processed this information. Her marriage hadn't just failed. She had been specifically targeted and manipulated by a predatory system that saw her military service not as an honor to be respected, but as a weakness to be exploited. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since they had sat down. "I need you to do what you do best, Captain. I need you to plan a mission. We have intelligence, we have evidence, and we have the element of surprise. But we need to be smart about this. Webb has corrupted judges before, and Judge Morrison might already be compromised." He handed her a business card for a different attorney, a woman named Catherine Torres, who specialized in military family law and federal corruption cases. Torres has been working with federal investigators on the Webb case. She's clean, she's brilliant, and she understands the kind of war you've been fighting. Sarah pocketed the card, her mind already working through the tactical implications. "How much time do we have?" "The court reconvenes in 2 hours for final arguments," Rodriguez said. "But if Torres can get an emergency motion filed with the federal court citing ongoing criminal investigation and judicial corruption, she can get this whole proceeding suspended pending a full review." Sarah stood up, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with mission planning. For the first time in months, she wasn't reacting to attacks, she was preparing to launch her own offensive. The rules of engagement had just changed completely. "Rodriguez," she said as they prepared to leave the coffee shop, "when this is over, when Webb and Marcus are both behind bars, I want to know about those other veterans, the women he's destroyed. They deserve justice too." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Captain, because this isn't just about your case anymore. This is about taking down an entire network of corruption that's been preying on the people who've served this country." As they walked back toward the courthouse, Sarah felt the weight of her true mission crystallizing. She wasn't just fighting for custody of Emma anymore, she was fighting to expose a system that had been systematically destroying the lives of her fellow veterans. The battlefield had expanded, the stakes had risen, and Captain Sarah Chen was ready to lead the charge. The war was about to begin in earnest, and this time she would be fighting on her own terms. Catherine Torres entered the courtroom like a guided missile finding its target. Sarah watched from her seat as the federal attorney strode through the double doors, her briefcase in one hand and a thick manila folder in the other. Torres moved with controlled precision of someone who had just spent 2 hours coordinating with federal investigators, and her presence immediately shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. Judge Morrison looked up with obvious irritation as Torres approached the bench. "Counselor, court is already in session. If you're here for a different matter, you'll need to wait." "Your Honor, I'm Catherine Torres, representing Captain Sarah Chen in this matter, and I have an emergency motion that requires immediate attention." Torres's voice carried an authority that made even Webb, who had been smugly reviewing his notes, look up with concern. Janet Mills, Sarah's previous attorney, looked confused and slightly relieved as she gathered her papers. "Your Honor, I'm withdrawing from this case, effective immediately. Captain Chen has retained new counsel." Webb shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Objection! This is clearly a delay tactic. You can't just change attorneys in the middle of final arguments." Torres smiled coolly and placed a thick document on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this is a federal court order suspending these proceedings pending investigation into allegations of judicial corruption, evidence tampering, and systematic fraud against military veterans." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Morrison's face went pale as she read the document, her eyes growing wider with each line. Marcus, who had been lounging confidently in his chair, suddenly sat up straight, his mouth falling open. Furthermore, Torres continued, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade, I have here sworn affidavits from federal investigators, financial records seized under warrant this morning, and testimony from 6 other military veterans who have been victimized by the same fraudulent scheme currently being perpetrated in this courtroom. Marshal Rodriguez, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, stepped forward. His hand moved to his radio, and Sarah heard him speak quietly into a changer mic. Control, this is Rodriguez. Execute the warrants. Webb's face had gone from flushed to ashen. He stood up uncertainly, his usual courtroom swagger completely gone. Your Honor, I don't know what kind of conspiracy theory this is, but I demand to know the basis for these wild accusations. Torres opened her briefcase and pulled out a laptop computer, which she connected to the courtroom's video display system. Mr. Webb, I'm going to show everyone in this room exactly what kind of operation you've been running. The large screen at the front of the courtroom lit up with financial records, bank statements, and email correspondence. Torres began methodically walking through the evidence, her presentation precise and devastating. Ladies and gentlemen, for the past 18 months, Harrison Webb and his law firm have been operating a systematic scheme to defraud military veterans, particularly women, of their assets and parental rights. The scheme works like this. They identify recently divorced or divorcing military personnel, often those returning from deployment, and they coordinate with corrupt spouses to maximize financial gain while destroying the veteran's credibility. The screen showed a spreadsheet with dozens of names, case numbers, and financial figures. Sarah could see her own name near the bottom of the list, along with astronomical dollar amounts that represented the value of assets that had been stolen or hidden. In Captain Chen's case, Mr. Webb helped her husband Marcus establish a network of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to hide marital assets while simultaneously painting Captain Chen as mentally unstable and unfit for custody. Torres clicked to the next slide, which showed bank records and wire transfers. Marcus Chen, with Webb's assistance, has moved over $2.3 million in marital assets to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. Money that Captain Chen earned through combat pay, hazard pay, and benefits earned through 15 years of military service. Marcus suddenly stood up, his face red with panic. This is insane. I don't know what she's talking about. Those records have to be fake. Sit down, Mr. Chen, Judge Morrison said sharply, her voice shaking slightly. The judge was clearly beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening in her courtroom.
Torres clicked to another slide showing email correspondence between Webb and Marcus dating back over a year. These communications, seized this morning under federal warrant, show extensive planning and coordination. Mr. Webb specifically advised Mr. Chen to time the divorce proceedings to coincide with Captain Chen's return from a classified deployment, when she would be most vulnerable and least able to properly defend herself. Sarah read the emails on the screen with growing horror and rage. Marcus had been planning this betrayal while she was still overseas, while she was still risking her life for her country. The emails showed Webb coaching Marcus on how to manipulate psychological evaluations, how to present her military service as a liability rather than an asset, and how to use her classified work history against her by preventing her from properly defending her character. But perhaps most damning, Torres said, clicking to the final slide, is this communication from Mr. Webb to Mr. Chen, dated 3 days ago. The email appeared on the screen, and Torres read it aloud. Don't worry about the federal records. Judge Morrison owes me favors going back 5 years. This case is already decided. Judge Morrison's face went completely white. She looked like she was about to be sick. The implication was clear. Webb had been bribing or blackmailing her, and her judicial decisions had been compromised. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again and 3 federal agents in dark suits entered. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair, approached Webb's table with handcuffs already in hand. Harrison Webb, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, judicial corruption, and violation of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The agent's voice echoed in the silent courtroom as she placed Webb in handcuffs. Webb's face was now completely drained of color. This is a mistake. You can't just come into a state courtroom and arrest people. I have rights. You had rights, the federal agent replied calmly. You forfeited them when you turned the American legal system into your personal ATM machine. A second federal agent approached Marcus, who was now standing beside his chair, swaying slightly as if he might faint. Marcus Chen, you're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, and perjury in federal proceedings. As the agents led both men away in handcuffs, Torres turned back to Judge Morrison. Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented today and the obvious compromise of these proceedings, we request that all previous rulings in this case be vacated and that full custody of the minor child, Emma Chen, be immediately returned to Captain Sarah Chen. Judge Morrison, who looked like she had aged 10 years in the past 20 minutes, nodded weakly. Granted. All previous rulings are vacated. Captain Chen, I apologize for the injustice that has occurred in my courtroom. Full custody is awarded to you, along with all marital assets that were rightfully yours. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of vindication, of justice finally served. She looked back at Marshal Rodriguez, who gave her a small, respectful nod. Torres approached Sarah as the courtroom began to empty. Captain, this is just the beginning. The federal investigation has uncovered evidence of similar schemes targeting over 200 military families across 12 states. We're going to need your testimony, and frankly, we're going to need your help identifying other victims. Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Whatever you need. These people destroyed families while we were overseas serving our country. They turned our sacrifice into their profit. That ends now. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her daughter Emma's bedroom, helping her pack for a camping trip with her Girl Scout troop. Emma, now 9 years old, had adjusted remarkably well to having her mother back in her life full-time. The trauma of the custody battle was fading, replaced by the stability and love that Sarah provided. The federal investigation had continued to expand, ultimately resulting in the prosecution of 37 individuals involved in the veteran fraud scheme. Webb received a 20-year federal sentence, while Marcus was sentenced to 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. More importantly, over $47 million in stolen assets had been recovered and returned to veteran families. Sarah had used her portion of the recovered funds to establish the Emma Chen Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided free legal assistance to military families facing fraudulent divorce proceedings. She worked closely with federal investigators and other veteran advocacy groups to identify and protect potential victims. Marshal Rodriguez had become a close friend and advisor to the foundation. His knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures, combined with Sarah's understanding of military culture, made them an effective team in hunting down predators who targeted veteran families. The small brass pen that Rodriguez wore on his collar had become the unofficial symbol of their work. Sarah now wore a similar pin, not as a badge of her own service, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought not overseas, but in American courtrooms defending the people who had already given everything for their country. That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mom, are you going to help more families like us?" Sarah brushed a strand of hair from Emma's forehead and smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. There are other kids out there whose moms and dads served our country, and some bad people tried to hurt their families. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen anymore." Emma nodded solemnly. "Good. Everybody should have their mom back." Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead and turned off the bedroom light. Through the window, she could see the lights of Phoenix stretching out towards the horizon. Somewhere out there were more families in crisis, more veterans being targeted by predators who saw their service as weakness rather than strength. But they wouldn't face those battles alone. Captain Sarah Chen had found her new mission, and she was ready to serve once again. 3 years had passed since the courthouse showdown that brought down Harrison Webb's criminal network, but Sarah Chen discovered that justice was an ongoing battle rather than a single victory. She sat in her office at the Emma Chen Foundation headquarters in downtown Phoenix, reviewing case files that arrived daily from across the country. Each folder represented another military family that had been targeted, another veteran whose service had been twisted into a weapon against them. The foundation had grown beyond anything Sarah had imagined possible. What started as a small legal aid office had evolved into a comprehensive support network with satellite offices in 8 states. They provided not just legal assistance, but financial counseling, psychological support, and investigative services to help veterans recover stolen assets and rebuild their lives. Maria Santos, the foundation's newest case manager, knocked on Sarah's office door. Maria herself was a Navy veteran who had been victimized by a scheme similar to Webb's operation, though her case had been handled by a different corrupt attorney in San Diego. Her personal experience with the predatory system made her invaluable in connecting with new clients who are often skeptical of trusting anyone in the legal profession.
"Sarah, we've got a situation developing in Dallas," Maria said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. Remember that case we've been tracking where the Army Ranger's wife disappeared with their kids and all their savings? Detective Morrison from Dallas PD just called. They found her, but it's not what we expected. Sarah looked up from the financial records she had been analyzing. Over the years, she had learned to recognize the patterns that indicated when a case was more complex than it initially appeared. What did they find? Jennifer Walsh, the missing wife, she's dead, has been for 6 months. But someone has been using her identity to drain her husband's accounts and manipulate the custody proceedings. Maria handed Sarah a police report and a series of bank statements. Someone murdered her and has been impersonating her throughout the entire legal process. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They had been tracking what they thought was a standard asset hiding scheme, but it had evolved into something far more sinister. The corruption they were fighting wasn't just financial anymore. It had become murderous. Sarah studied the police report, her mind automatically shifting into the tactical analysis mode that had kept her alive during her military service. Who's representing the husband in the divorce proceedings? That's the disturbing part, Maria replied. The attorney is Lawrence Kellerman, and his methods are almost identical to Webb's old playbook. Same psychiatric evaluations, same financial manipulation tactics, same systematic destruction of the veteran's credibility. Sarah had heard whispers about Kellerman for months. He had appeared on their radar shortly after Webb's conviction, operating out of Dallas and targeting primarily male veterans with significant disabilities or PTSD diagnoses. The Foundation had been building a case file on him, but they hadn't realized the scope of his criminal operations. "We need to contact Marshal Rodriguez immediately," Sarah said, reaching for her secure phone. "If Kellerman is connected to murder, this has moved beyond civil fraud into federal homicide investigation territory." Rodriguez answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the familiar tone of someone who was already deep into a complex investigation. "Sarah, please tell me you're calling about something other than the Dallas situation." "You already know about Jennifer Walsh," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Rodriguez's federal task force had been tracking the remnants of Webb's network for years, following the money trails and criminal connections that had survived the initial prosecutions. "We've been watching Kellerman for 8 months," Rodriguez confirmed. "Jennifer Walsh is the third military spouse who's died under suspicious circumstances in cases where he was involved. We think we're looking at a systematic elimination of witnesses who could expose the financial fraud network." Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with realizing the true scope of an enemy's operations. They're killing people to cover up divorce fraud? It's bigger than that. Webb's network was just one tentacle of a much larger criminal organization. When we took him down, we forced them to adapt their methods. Now they're using more permanent solutions to eliminate problems. Rodriguez's voice was grim. "Sarah, I need you to be very careful. The Foundation's work has made you a high-profile target. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to kill to protect their operations." The weight of that reality settled over Sarah like a familiar tactical burden. She had spent years in combat zones where death was a constant possibility. But the idea that her work, helping fellow veterans, had put her own family at risk was a different kind of threat entirely. "What do you need from us?" she asked, falling back into the mission planning mindset that had served her throughout her military career. "We need the Foundation to go dark on any active investigations involving Kellerman or his associates," Rodriguez said. "But we also need your help with something else. We've identified what we believe is the central command structure of this criminal organization, and we think they're planning to eliminate several more military spouses who have evidence of the financial fraud schemes." Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up the secure database where the Foundation tracked criminal networks targeting veterans. Over 3 years of investigations, they had mapped connections between dozens of corrupt attorneys, judges, and financial institutions across multiple states. The pattern was becoming clear. What looked like isolated fraud cases were actually coordinated attacks by a sophisticated criminal organization. "How can we help protect the potential targets?" Sarah asked. "We need the Foundation to coordinate with our witness protection efforts," Rodriguez explained. "But more than that, we need your tactical expertise. These people are using military-style planning and coordination in their operations. They've studied how to exploit the vulnerabilities of military families, and they're using that knowledge to maximum effect." Sarah understood immediately. The criminal network had essentially declared war on American military families, using their own service and sacrifices as weapons against them. It was a form of warfare that required a military response, and Sarah's unique combination of special operations experience and intimate knowledge of veteran issues made her perfectly positioned to lead that response. "We'll do whatever you need," Sarah said, "but I want full operational control over the Foundation's involvement." These people made this personal when they started targeting military families. Over the following weeks, the Emma Chen Foundation transformed from a legal aid organization into something resembling a military intelligence operation. Sarah worked closely with Rodriguez's federal task force to identify potential targets, coordinate protection details, and gather evidence that could be used to dismantle the entire criminal network. The work was dangerous and complex. Sarah found herself drawing on skills she hadn't used since her Delta Force days, coordinating surveillance operations, analyzing criminal intelligence, and planning tactical responses to threats to innocent families. But unlike her military service, where the enemy was clearly defined and geographically distant, this war was being fought in American courtrooms and suburban neighborhoods. Emma, now 12 years old, had grown accustomed to the security measures that had become part of their daily life. Sarah had been honest with her daughter about the dangers they faced, explaining that some very bad people were angry about their work helping military families. Emma had responded with the resilience and maturity that often characterized military children, accepting the security protocols as just another part of their mission to help others. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez's team intercepted communications between Kellerman and his handlers, revealing the location of a planning meeting for what they called Operation Clean Slate. The criminal network was planning to simultaneously eliminate 17 military spouses across 6 states, all of whom had evidence that could expose the full scope of their operations. Sarah stared at the intelligence report that Rodriguez had shared with her, feeling the familiar pre-mission adrenaline surge that had carried her through countless dangerous operations. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for her country or her unit. She was fighting for every military family that had ever been betrayed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. "Rodriguez," she said into her secure phone, "it's time to finish this war." The final battle was about to begin, and Captain Sarah Chen was ready to lead from the front once again. The safe house in Tucson buzzed with the controlled intensity of a military operations center. Sarah surveyed the room where federal agents, Foundation investigators, and protected witnesses worked side by side, coordinating the largest takedown operation in the history of veteran-targeted crime.
Banks of monitors displayed real-time surveillance feeds from 6 states, while encrypted communication systems maintained contact with protection teams guarding the 17 targeted military spouses. Rodriguez stood before a large tactical display board, briefing the assembled teams on the synchronized raids that would commence in exactly 4 hours. Operation Clean Slate was their mistake, he announced to the room. They got greedy, tried to eliminate too many witnesses at once, and gave us the perfect opportunity to destroy their entire network. Sarah reviewed the final intelligence reports from her position at the command station. The criminal organization's structure was now completely mapped, from street-level operatives to the shadowy financiers who had been funding the systematic destruction of military families for over a decade. Lawrence Kellerman was just middle management in an enterprise that had generated over $200 million through veteran fraud schemes. The mastermind behind it all was someone they had never suspected, retired federal judge Patricia Brennan, who had used her knowledge of the legal system and her network of corrupt contacts to build a criminal empire that specifically targeted military families during their most vulnerable moments. Brennan had recognized that veterans returning from deployment were ideal victims because their classified service records made it difficult for them to defend themselves, and their struggles with transition back to civilian life could be weaponized against them in court. Maria Santos approached Sarah's station with an update from the Dallas protection team. Jennifer Wash's husband David is secure, and he's agreed to testify about everything he witnessed. The forensic accountants have traced over $3 million that was stolen from his accounts using his dead wife's forged signatures. Sarah nodded grimly. David Walsh's case had become symbolic of the entire operation. He was a decorated Army Ranger who had lost his leg to an IED in Iraq, and while he was struggling through months of rehabilitation, his wife had been murdered and her identity used to systematically destroy his financial future and steal his children. The cruelty and calculation involved in that level of betrayal represented everything Sarah had been fighting against. The secure communication system crackled with updates from teams positioned across the country. In Dallas, federal agents were preparing to arrest Kellerman and his associates. In Miami, another team was moving against a corrupt family court judge who had been taking bribes to award custody to abusive spouses. In Seattle, financial investigators were seizing the assets of shell companies that had been used to launder stolen veteran benefits. But the most important target was in Phoenix, where Judge Patricia Brennan maintained her private office and coordinated the criminal network's operations. Sarah had requested permission to lead the team that would arrest Brennan personally. After everything the woman had done to destroy military families, Sarah wanted to look her in the eye when justice finally arrived. Rodriguez checked his watch and gave the final authorization. "All teams execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, execute." Sarah led her team through the corridors of the upscale Phoenix office building where Brennan ran her consulting firm, which was actually the command center for her criminal operations. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that they were conducting a military-style raid to arrest someone who had spent years exploiting military families. They found Brennan in her luxurious corner office, calmly shredding documents while monitoring news feeds of the coordinated arrest happening across the country. She looked up as Sarah's team entered, showing no surprise at their arrival. "Captain Chen, I presume," Brennan said, her voice carrying the same arrogant authority she had once wielded from the federal bench. "I've been expecting you, though I must admit, I'm disappointed it took you this long to trace the operation back to me." Sarah approached Brennan's desk, noting the expensive artwork and furnishings that had been purchased with money stolen from military families. "Patricia Brennan, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, fraud, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." Brennan laughed coldly as the federal agents placed her in handcuffs. "You think this ends anything? You think arresting me will stop what we've built? There are hundreds of corrupt attorneys, judges, and officials who have been making money off your kind for decades. This is just one network." Sarah met Brennan's gaze steadily. "You're right. This doesn't end the problem, but it ends you, and it saves the families you are planning to destroy. Sometimes that's enough." As they led Brennan away, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that came at the end of a successful mission. The immediate threat had been neutralized, the criminals were in custody, and the targeted families were safe. But she also knew that this was just one victory in a much larger war. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the podium in a packed congressional hearing room, testifying before the House Committee on Veterans Affairs about the systematic targeting of military families by criminal networks. The hearings had been prompted by the successful prosecution of Brennan's organization and had resulted in comprehensive reforms to veteran legal protections. Emma, now 13, and growing into the confident young woman Sarah had always hoped she would become, sat in the gallery watching her mother testify. Sarah had taught her daughter that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with truth and persistence and the courage to stand up for people who couldn't protect themselves. The Emma Chen Foundation had evolved into a national organization with congressional funding and partnerships with federal law enforcement agencies. They had helped over 800 military families recover stolen assets and rebuild their lives. But more importantly, they had changed the systems that allowed predators to target veterans in the first place. Rodriguez, now promoted to lead a specialized federal task force focused on veteran-targeted crime, worked closely with the foundation to identify and prosecute criminal networks before they could destroy more families.
The brass pin he wore had become a symbol recognized throughout the law enforcement community, representing the commitment to protect those who had already sacrificed so much for their country. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sometimes think about the moment in that Phoenix courtroom when she first noticed Rodriguez's pin and realized she wasn't fighting alone anymore. That small piece of brass had represented something larger than military service or shared experience. It had represented the principle that some fights were worth having even when the odds seemed impossible. The war against those who preyed on military families would never be completely won, but Sarah had learned that victory wasn't always about achieving perfect justice. Sometimes victory was simply about standing up when others couldn't, fighting back when others wouldn't, and ensuring that the next family under attack wouldn't have to face their battles alone. As she tucked Emma into bed that night, her daughter looked up at her with serious eyes that reminded Sarah so much of herself at that age. "Mom, do you think we've helped enough people now?" Sarah smiled and brushed a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "Sweetheart, there's no such thing as helping enough people. Every family we save, every criminal we stop, every system we fix makes the world a little bit better for the next person who needs help. That's what service really means." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "So we just keep going?" "We keep going. As long as there are people who need help, and as long as we have the strength to give it, we keep going." Outside their window, the lights of Phoenix stretched towards the horizon, and Sarah knew that somewhere out there, another military family was facing their own nightmare, their own betrayal, their own moment of crisis. But they wouldn't face it alone. Captain Sarah Chen and her army of allies would be there, ready to fight for justice, ready to stand guard, ready to serve once more. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.